been 15 and a half years since the terrorist attacks of September 11th that defined the presidency of George W. Bush. The United States' response to that day has claimed the lives of thousands of American servicemen and women in Iraq and Afghanistan and left many more permanently injured in conflicts that continue today. In the 8 years since he left office, President Bush has committed himself to helping the veterans of those wars. The 43rd president also picked up a pretty good painting habit in his post-presidency. In a new book called Portraits of Courage, Bush shares his own paintings of vets as a way to tell their stories. For our Sunday sit-down, I traveled with President Bush to MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, where he was visiting some wounded warriors. Where did the painting come from?
Well, I was bored. I mean, I was pretty busy. I was working hard at the Bush Center on the programs we have there. I was exercising a lot, but it wasn't enough. And so, by chance, somebody suggested I read Winston Churchill's essay, Painting as a Pastime, and I did. And basically said, if that old boy can paint, I can paint. And so started painting. Hired an instructor, painted a cube, and then a watermelon. And painted some world leaders because a really good artist said, you ought to try that, which really boosted my confidence. And then somebody who knew I painted world leaders suggested I paint the faces that nobody knows. And so I decided that this would be a wonderful opportunity to honor those who served and to call attention to programs that work.
Portraits of Courage is a collection of 66 paintings, all by President Bush, each one a tribute to a veteran of the wars he launched after 9/11.
So let's go through some of these paintings if we could, Mr. President.
Sure.
Scott Lilly, this one is extraordinary because it's not just Staff Sergeant Lilly.
I got to know Lily's parents first. They were at the White House when I landed on Marine One, and I took to him immediately, and they told me their son was in the hospital. I checked on him, went over to visit him, and he was in a coma. And he came to the White House a couple of times, was gradually getting somewhat better, but I was never really confident that he would be able to live a full life. About 5 years later, I see his name on the list of people who wanted to play in our golf tournament. And I said, is this a Lily that I know? Yeah. And so Lily came, much to my surprise. And during that period, he said, I'd like to bring my daughter by to meet you. And so I painted Lily and his daughter. And Lily's got a big scar on his head where they had to go inside his cranium. And I was just struck by, near death, and then, a beautiful little child.
President Bush painted fathers, mothers, friends, and immigrants.
Specialist Juan Carlos Hernandez.
Yeah, lost his leg.
Lost his leg, and he's got an extraordinary story. He came to America as an undocumented child.
Correct. His mom was seeking a better life, brought Juan Carlos and his brother, I think, over across the border, like a lot of other people had in our state of Texas. Decides he wants to pay back to the country that meant a lot to him, and loses his leg. But the interesting thing about him is that he became a U.S. citizen in Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan. My attitude about our vets who are willing to wear our uniform is if they're not a U.S. citizen, we ought to expedite their service.
Is he a good example, Mr. President, of a child who comes to the country? His parents may have broken the law, but ought to be allowed to stay and contribute to society.
Well, certainly in this case, I hope Americans understand the contribution he's made. I mean, this is a person who willingly said, I want to volunteer, and went into combat, all in the defense of the country, loses his leg. Surely Americans would be able to say, this is the kind of person we want as a citizen.
President Bush failed to achieve the comprehensive immigration reform he sought while in office, but he still believes in it, including that so-called dreamers, children like Specialist Hernandez brought to the United States illegally by their parents, should have a legal place in America.
More broadly, though, do you think it's a good idea for dreamers to be allowed to stay here?
Well, I think somebody who's vested time and effort and can make a contribution to our country, will be a really good citizen. It's obviously immigration is a very political issue. I tried to reform it, and one of my big regrets is I couldn't get Congress to respond. And I think the plan I laid out ultimately is the plan that would be accepted.
Based on what you know about running the country, running the immigration system, do you think it's practical to go in and deport millions and millions of people who are here illegally?
I don't see how that would work. And I'm not sure that's the intention of our government. I think people who are charged with doing that, if that is the charge, I'm not sure it is, would say it's going to be hard to do. Now, the idea of running out rapists and murderers, I think all Americans can agree to that. I think it's very important for people to know that when I talk about freedom of the press or immigration reform, I don't do so to criticize anybody. I mean, I understand how hard this job is. I do so because I want to share what I've learned and what I've seen.
President Bush is famously loath to criticize a sitting president directly, but he does offer reminders about what he thinks America should represent.
I want to ask you about some comments you made right after September 11th, less than a week after, where you reached out and you said we have to reach out and talk to our Muslim brothers and sisters in this country and embrace them.
That's not what Islam is all about. Islam is peace. These terrorists don't represent peace. They represent evil and war.
Which is quite the opposite of the rhetoric we hear from the White House right now, including the executive order proposed by the president that would ban travel from 7 countries that are predominantly Muslim. Why did you feel it was important to speak that way about Muslims?
Well, I believe that religion, freedom of religion, is one of our bedrock principles. That people should be allowed to worship without the government telling them how they can worship. That we ought to honor people regardless of the religion they choose, or honor them if they choose no religion. That we're all equal. And so after 9/11, I read reports where some Muslim women were being harassed, and I also read reports where American women were walking women of color to grocery stores, and it affected me because I didn't want us to lose our soul. I didn't want the attacks to cause us to change.
Hello, Today fans. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking that button down there and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives.